Welcome to Flop Play as the Preflop Raiser. In this video, we're going to be discussing the topics of bot texture, flop bet size, alternative lines, and I will show you a bunch of examples to reinforce the points mentioned earlier. Flop play as the c-better. The flop c-bet is a powerful weapon to take down the pot. Why is it so effective? So this is a pretty standard part of most modern poker strategy books. Every time after you raise as the preflop raiser, you would usually want to be betting the flop. So why is it so good? Why is it so effective? So the truth is that most opponents tend to fold way too much against the continuation bet, and most bet or mediocre players tend to play according to their absolute hand strength. So they tend to play a fit or fold style. If they connect with the board, they will continue. And if they miss, they will just fold. So what you'll notice is that in Texas Hold'em, it's not that easy to hit a hand. You would probably connect with the flop about 40% of the time. And the other 60% of the time, you would probably have nothing. So these players are not defending as much as they should, and the continuation bet works pretty well. Board texture. So how do we classify board texture? There are two main ways to classify board texture. The first way is the old school way of approaching board texture, wet versus dry. We want to be looking out for the presence of flush draws and the presence of straight draws. So the more draws there are possible on the board, the wetter the flop texture is. So some common mistakes that beginners tend to make is that they're often super afraid of possible flush draws on the flop on a two-tone texture. So for example, if the board was ace 9-5 with two hearts, a lot of players will just classify this as a wet texture, even though the three cards are not really connected and there are hardly any straight draws. So I would say that the presence of straight draws is more important than the presence of flush draws when we are dealing with classifying whether a board is wet or dry. Another important thing to take note of is that we must think of how our opponent's range connects with the board. So for example, a board like ace 5-6, even though there are a bunch of possible straight draws like 2-3, 3-4, 2-4, 7-8. So many players are not playing these hands, especially the unsuited versions. So this board is not really wet, it's more on the drier side. Contrast this with a board like ace 10-9. People tend to play high cards more often, so it's wetter in the sense that our opponent is going to be likelier to have more straight draws in his range. The second way to classify board texture is static versus volatile or dynamic. So not only do we want to look out for the presence of draws, we also want to look out for whether the board is mainly comprised of high cards or low cards. So what do we mean by static? Static boards are boards which do not tend to change much. So if a hand is ahead, it would probably remain ahead most of the time. If it's behind, it's probably going to remain behind most of the time. On the other hand, volatile boards are those where the turn and river cards could change the hand strengths of both players or all players in the hand drastically. So there is likely going to be a large equity change on future streets. So here are a couple of examples of varying board textures. I'm just going to briefly cover them since I'm going to have even more examples in future slides with much greater detail. Okay, so the first board texture, it's a board containing two high cards, so it's more of a static board. It's on the drier side. There are no possible flush draws, some straight draws or the Broadway straight draws. So it's static and slightly on the dry side. The second board, Jack 10-7, there's a possible flush draw on the board. Any 8 and any 9 would complete a straight. There are plenty of straight draws as well for the Broadways. Ace King, Ace Queen, and King Queen. So this is a very wet flop, and it's also highly volatile and dynamic. The third board is 5-5 deuce. Both are low cards. All 3 cards are low cards, so it's volatile. Most hands have 2 overcards to the 5. So even a hand like 6-7 has about 25% equity against a hand like Ace 9, for example. So, but it's dry because there aren't too many draws besides Ace 3, Ace 4, 3-4. The fourth board is a board which is on the drier side. It's not as static as Ace King deuce because a hand like King Queen or Jack 10 has 2 overcards against a hand like 9-8. The fifth board is very wet and very volatile. So any spade will change the hand strength of various hands to a huge extent. The final board texture is a little wet and it's on the volatile side as well. So we have the first board texture here. Ace King King Rainbow. So this is a classic example of a very static board. So let's see how various hands fare against a hand like Pocket Queens. Pocket Queens has 91.5% equity against Pocket 8s. Pocket Queens has 91.5% equity against Pocket 8s. 95% equity against 10-9 suited. And 9.6% equity against Ace 7 suited. So as you see, it's a classic way ahead, way behind situation. If we were ahead, it's very unlikely that our opponent will outdraw us on a later street. If we were already behind, we are probably drawing close to dead. I guess we have 2 outs to a full house. So static boards, equities aren't going to change very often, and thus it's a good opportunity to play our hands more passively. Second example, Ace King Deuce. As mentioned earlier, this is not as static as Ace King King, but it's still pretty static. So King Queen has 82% equity against 4-5, 92.6% equity against 5-6 suited, 84% equity against Queen Jack, which has a Gutshot against us. Another example, Ace Deuce Deuce. In the traditional sense, it's even drier than the Ace King Deuce board since there are absolutely no draws. I guess there are draws like 4-5, but in early positions, no one ever plays 4-5. So on the other hand, if we use the static versus volatile classification, it's less static than the Ace King Deuce board. So why is that so? It's because a hand like second pair, so an example here is Pocket 10s, it's completely crushing a hand like 9-8. But hands like King 10, which has 1 overcut, so a hand like King 10 has 15% equity against us, and a hand like Queen Jack, which is 2 overcuts to our pair, has about 25% equity against us. Next example, 5-5-3, a dynamic board, Ace 9. So a hand like King Queen has 6 outs against us, so we only have 72.5% equity. Ace 4 of hearts has a backdoor flush draw against us and a Gutshot as well. So even though we have the stronger ace high, he has a lot of opportunity to improve. Sometimes we end up with a split pot situation as well. Let's say on a 3, both of us will have ace high, and the kicker wouldn't play. So yes, we're pretty even against that hand. Against a hand like 10-8 suited, which is 2 overcuts to the 5. We are doing slightly better than compared to King Queen. So we have 77% equity in this case. Next example, 9-8-3 of spades. It's a lot more volatile and dynamic. So how does top pair, top kicker compare to other hands? King Queen. King Queen has 2 overcuts and a flush draw. So we are actually an underdog. So you might be surprised, but King Queen is actually a lot stronger in this example. 5-6 suited, which is a Gutshot. We have 78.5% equity. Queen 6 of diamonds, so he has 1 overcut. We have 82% equity. And the final example here, 10-9-8 of spades. It's very, very volatile and dynamic. So many cards can change hand strengths of various hands. Any spade, any 7, any 6, any jack, any queen, even an ace and a king can often improve some hands to the best hand. So this is very dynamic. A hand like ace 9, which is second pair top kicker, how does it fare against other hands? So king 5 with the king of spades, we only have 53% equity. Against a hand like ace queen, 2 overcuts with the Gutshot, we have 70% equity. Jack 6 suited, which is an open-ended draw, we have 59% equity against that. Flop bet size. So what bet size should we use? So hopefully after this segment you will understand what bet size you should be using on the flop. So we briefly covered the concept of auto profit frequencies in the previous videos. If you recall earlier on, a half pot bet requires our opponent to fold at least a third of the time in order to auto profit in this spot. A 2/3 pot size bet requires 40% folds or more, and a pot size bet requires at least 50% folds or more in order to be profitable here. Most players tend to fold more than 45% of their ranges on the flop, which means that it's often going to be highly profitable to bet the flop with a really high frequency, as we are going to have a nice auto profit spot here. So how should we adjust our bet size based on the board texture? On static flops, we should be more inclined to use a smaller bet size, and on dynamic flops, we should be more inclined to use larger bet sizes. Why is this the case? So one way to approach this is to think about the elasticity of our opponent's continuation range. On static flops, our opponents will be unlikely to change their calling ranges too much. So imagine if the board was ace, king, deuce. If we bet half pot versus if we end up betting 80% of the pot, I think our opponents should continue calling the flop with a fairly similar range of hands. In this case, his continuation range can be said to be inelastic, meaning that his calling range is not going to change much even if the bet sizes change significantly. On the other hand, on a more dynamic flop like 5-5-3, I think our opponent's range is going to be highly elastic. So if we bet half pot, he might call with any 2 overcuts. If we bet full pot, he might fold a hand like king queen or king 10 and only call with ace high or better. We also want to think about how much equity we are denying our opponents. So if you recall in the first example, ace, king, king, rainbow, betting isn't so important. Betting to take down the pot and deny our opponents the opportunity to improve on the later street is less important, simply because he has less equity in the first place. On the other hand, on a volatile texture like 553, plenty of hands have a lot of equity, like 25 to 30%, so that's like 2 overcuts. So it's going to be a much larger win for us if we bet and we get him to fold his equity share of the pot. Skipping the flop c-bet. When should we opt to check instead? When should we avoid putting in a continuation bet on the flop? So we are going to be talking about check folding, meaning we check and give up. Check calling. When should we check call or call? When should we check call out of position, or when should we check back the flop in position? When should we check raise as the pre-flop raiser? This is only going to apply to out of position play. Okay, so first of all, when should we give up as the pre-flop raiser? So when I mean give up, it means that we check the flop with the intention of giving up against a bet. This doesn't mean that we are giving up for sure on the turn or the river. If our opponent continues to show weakness, we might consider putting in a delayed bluff on the turn or the river. So when should we deviate from our default strategy of betting and give up? It's going to be pretty similar to other streets. So we want to think about how much equity we have. If we have low pot equity, if we have no draw, no overcuts, we should be more inclined to give up and not bet the flop. Also, if we have low equity, we should be more inclined to give up as well. So when do we have less full equity? Firstly, when the board is wet and has plenty of draws, or when the board connects well with our opponent's range. So on such boards, we should be more inclined to give up because our opponent is less likely to fold. Also, we should be more inclined to give up when it's multi-way, because it's much harder to get multiple players to fold, and thus it's going to be a lot less profitable to bluff into multiple players. Check calling as the preflop raiser. When should we play passively with a mate hand? So usually we want to be playing more passively when we have a medium strength hand. So it's usually second pair in most cases. Sometimes we want to check call a low pocket pair or bottom pair. Sometimes it might also make sense to check call with ace high, especially on low paired boards. Another reason to play your hand more passively is when we have the board absolutely crash. So what I mean by this is if we connect with all the cards on the flop, and it is going to be very difficult for our opponent to have something. So for example, if the board was ace king king and we have ace king, so it's just simply going to be very difficult for our opponent to have an ace or a king. So that would be a pretty good situation to slow play. Yeah, so the most common examples is when we flop top set or when we flop a full house. We also want to consider the board. We should be more inclined to play our medium strength hands more passively on static boards. We want to think about the vulnerability of our hand. If our hand is more vulnerable, betting to fold out our opponent's equity share will often make more sense than to play our hand more passively. And on dynamic flops, it often makes more sense to be more aggressive with medium strength hands. Denying our opponent his equity share of the pot is going to be that much more valuable on dynamic flops. So some of you might be wondering, how is check calling going to be good? My hand is going to be face up. My opponent is going to put me on a medium strength hand. So this is going to pose a huge problem. I also find a lot of difficulty playing more passively. I don't know where I'm at the hand. I want to bet and bet for information. So here are some of the typical worries and problems faced by you guys. So there's some ways to address this problem. You could just start slow playing some top pairs and monsters for balance. I would typically recommend check calling the flop with strong hands, so like top pair, top kicker, or maybe top set. About 20% of the time is enough to make yourself a bit tricky. You would also want to check call the flop with some draws occasionally, so that your opponent cannot just blow you off the hand whenever a draw completes. But in general, especially at the lower limits, I think balancing isn't so important. So the general tendency of the NL2 and the NL5 population is that they tend to bluff once or twice, but they are often unable to empty the clip and fire 3 times. So if that's the case, then there's really no need to slow play and trap so often. We just want to check call twice with a hand like second pair, and we should win enough of the time, at least against most players. So I'm not saying this applies to everyone, but it applies to a large percentage of the population. When should we check raise as the preflop raiser? So when we can expect our opponent to bet very often when check 2, this is going to be a highly profitable spot to go for our check raise. So the main thing to think about is our opponent's tendencies. So if he is aggressive, he is probably going to be betting really often. Board texture also has a part to play in deciding how often our opponent is going to bet the flop when check 2. So if you recall earlier, when we were discussing about board texture, it makes more sense to bluff with a higher frequency on a drier board texture. On the flip side, bluffing on a wetter board texture makes less sense. As a result, we should be giving up more often as the preflop raiser on a wetter board texture. So if the preflop caller knows that we are giving up really often, we should expect his strategy to involve bluffing a lot when check 2, which in turn makes it a great spot to have some sort of check raising range here. So we want to be bluff check raising sometimes and doing it with strong hands sometimes. Yeah, so we want to select some monsters, some really strong mate hands like 2 pairs sets, strong combo draws. I think those make great candidates for check raising as well. And of course some slightly weaker draws like backdoor draws. So let's get started with all the examples. Example 1. The button raises to 3 big blinds with ace king of hearts. The small blind calls and the big blind calls. So we have a 3-way pot. And we get a Jack 9-6 rainbow flop. It's checked to us at the button, and what should we do? So let's analyze various factors and decide whether we should check back the flop or bet the flop. So first of all, pot equity. I would say that our pot equity is kind of low. We do have 2 overcards, but it's going to be a lot weaker on a coordinated flop because our opponent will often end up drawing to a straight, or he might have plenty of 2 pairs. There are no possible flush draws on the flop. At the same time, we do not have any backdoor flush draws. We do not have any straight draws. Our full equity is also low. First of all, it's a coordinated flop. Given the fact that people tend to play connected hands pre-flop, our opponents will have straight draws pretty often. It's also a 3-way flop, so it's going to be a lot harder to get both players to fold. So my final verdict here is that we should definitely check and not bet. Next example, it's going to be in the same positions, exact same situation. Only difference now is that we have king queen of spades instead. Should we bet or should we check? So in this case, I think our pot equity here is a lot stronger. We have a Gutshot straight draw, we have a backdoor king high flush draw, and we have 2 overcards. Our overcards here are weaker, but they are compensated by the fact that we have the straight draw and the backdoor flush draw. Our full equity is still low. The board is still the same, so it's still coordinated and it's still multi-way. But I think our pot equity is enough to justify a bet here. So my verdict is to bet 6 big blinds. Third example, now it's a heads up flop, button raises with king queen of spades and the big blind calls. The board texture is different as well. Jack 6-6 rainbow. Do we bet or do we check? So I think our pot equity here is reasonable. We have 2 overcards, which are a lot stronger on this board as compared to the previous board. We also have a backdoor king high flush draw. We actually have some backdoor straight draws as well. Our full equity here is medium. It's a dry flop. There are no straight or flush draws on the board. It's also heads up, which means that it's a lot easier to bluff out a single opponent in the hand. So final verdict, I would bet slightly more than half pot here. Even half pot is fine. Example 4. Under the gun raises to 3 big blinds with 9-8 suited. The big blind calls. And the big blind checks to us on an A6-6 double diamond flop. Should we bet or should we check? Pot equity is low. We have flopped absolutely nothing. On the other hand, our full equity is pretty high here. It's a dry flop. There is a flush draw, but there are no straight draws. It's also paired, which means that it is harder for our opponent to flop a pair. It's a heads up flop, meaning that it's easier to get everyone to fold. Our perceived range is also heavily weighted towards Ace-X, given the fact that we are raising from under the gun. So I think it's a good spot to bet the flop. Example 5. It's the exact same situation, only in this case we have pocket kings. So should we check back on the flop or should we bet? So our pot equity is decent but not strong enough. We have second pair and it's not very vulnerable. Our full equity is going to be pretty high here. So once again, it's a dry flop, it's heads up. So if you think about it in this way, the full equity is high. So you might be thinking, okay, so that makes it a good spot to bet. But on the other hand, if it's a good bluffing spot, then you could assume that it's not a good spot to value bet a hand like pocket kings. Yeah, so it's a good spot to bluff and a bad spot to value bet thinly. So I think checking back makes the most sense. Example 6. The cutoff raises to 3 big blinds with king 10 offsuit and the button calls. So the board is ace 10 6. And what should the cutoff do in this case? Example 6. In this case, our pot equity is decent. We have second pair top kicker. And it's a pretty high cut, the 10. It's not too vulnerable. There aren't all that many overcuts. And the king will also improve us to 2 pair. Our full equity here is also going to be low if we bet. It's a wet flop. There are many straight and flush draws possible. And it's a heads up flop. So in this case, it might be a bit higher, but the board texture plays a larger role. Also, when we are thinking about whether to bet or not with a value hand, it's more important to evaluate the strength of our hand as compared to our full equity. So what's the verdict here? I think it's best to check call. Example 7. We raise with pocket 8s to 3 big blinds, the button calls. The board is ace 9 2 and we have third pair. Should we bet or should we check? So let's weigh all the different factors together once again. Our pot equity here is decent, maybe more on the weaker side. We have third pair. It's pretty vulnerable given that there are so many overcuts. Any 10 jack queen king, which is about a third of the deck, will weaken our hand significantly. On the other hand, our full equity is high, so it might make sense to turn our hand into a bluff, just bet and try to take the pot down right away. It's a dry flop. There are no straight draws, which makes it a nice bluffing spot. It's also a heads up flop. So what's the final verdict? I think this is a spot where all the options are kind of close. So betting is okay. Our hand is vulnerable, so if we bet and fold out a hand like king queen, it's still going to be a win for us since king queen has 25% equity against us. Checking is fine because betting doesn't achieve all that much besides denying our opponent's equity share with his overcuts. So if we bet here, we are isolating ourselves against stronger hands. We can't really bet for value against worse hands. We can't really bet to bluff out better hands because a 9 is never folding. Pocket 10s to pocket kings are never folding. A king is never folding. So there is no value to be had with a bet. So that's a strong argument for checking. So the main differentiating factor is the fact that we can deny our opponent equity share, his equity share, and our hand is a bit difficult to play if we check. So I think checking is reasonable. I would typically prefer to check, but I wouldn't hate a bet as well. So do we check call or check fold? If our opponent doesn't bluff too often on this board, then check folding makes the most sense. If our opponent is sufficiently aggressive, we probably want to be check calling instead. So I don't have a clear answer for this board, but here's a very good example of how to take into consideration all the different factors. Another thing to take note is the strength of our pair. So on an ace-9 deuce board, I'm a lot more inclined to bet pocket 3s. I'm a lot less inclined to bet pocket 10s. Because pocket 10s is just a lot stronger and less vulnerable. Example 8. The cutoff raises to 3 big blinds. And the button calls. So we have the same texture. So once again, as mentioned, our pot equity is on the weaker side. Our hand is a lot more vulnerable. The board texture remains the same. Our 4 equities here remains high. So this is a lot better of a spot. So just bet right away and try to take down the pot. Example 9. MP raises to 3 big blinds with king queen and the button calls. The pot has 7.5 big blinds and MP flops the nuts. So should he check? Should he bet? This is what we want to find out. Okay, so pot equity is high. Obviously we have the nuts. So this presents a very good incentive for us to want to raise and build the pot. So if we were to bet, we could only get 3 streets of value. If we were to go for a check raise, we might be able to stack our opponent. Secondly, we need to consider the board texture. In this case, it's wet. So I think if we do check on this flop, we're going to be perceived as giving up most of the time. And we can expect the button to bet very often when checked too. At the same time, since the board is really wet, he is highly likely to call a bet if we bet here. So this would be an argument for betting. So I think either option is fine, either betting or going for a check raise. So obviously we are not going to check for with this hand, and I think check calling is just too passive. But I like to check raise a lot more with this hand. So here's the final example. We have the exact same situation. The only difference now is that MP has ace king instead of king queen. So should we bet or should we check raise? So I think our equity is on the lower side. We do have 2 overcuts, which are pretty weak in this case given the board texture. Even if we hit our king, a queen will have a straight. If we hit our ace, I think he will have plenty of 2 pairs. We have a Gutshot straight draw, and we have the backdoor nut flush draw. The board texture is very wet and dynamic. Once again, he is highly likely to bet when checked too. He's highly likely to call. So what should we do here? I think I would prefer a check raise by far. If we bet here, we get called a lot, and he might not fold for 2 streets. If we check raise the flop, he's going to bluff pretty often, and we will get to take down the pot. We are also in a position where we could barrel our stack off and push him off some top pair hands. So what's the verdict? I think check raising is the best line. Without the ace of spade, I would consider check calling or betting. So check calling is good if you want to represent like queen jack or queen 10, ace 10. So a medium strength hand where he bets once as a bluff and then you try to take the pot down on a later street. That could make sense. You could also just bet. This brings us to the end of flop play as the preflop raiser. In the next lesson, we're going to be talking about flop play as the preflop caller. So see you in the next lesson and have a nice day.